Welcome to the Mobile Hunters Dojo, a community helping hunters reach their full potential in the woods and in life. I'm your host, Matt Lear. Come on in, kick off your shoes, and take a seat on the mat as we develop a mindset for success, forge self-discipline, practice the art of continuous improvement, and hone our craft. Welcome back to the dojo. I'm your host, Matt Lear. And before we jump into the episode, I want to let you know about something we're doing over at the Mobile Hunters Dojo YouTube channel. So if you didn't know, we do have a YouTube channel and all of our podcasts go up there, even the 10-minute Tuesdays. But we're also going to add what we call the mentality vlog. And we're going to drop this every Wednesday at 9 p.m. And we're going to cover the mentality of a mobile hunter. So we're going to go into scouting, setups. We're going to go over gear. We're going to do physical fitness. We're also going to talk about just the mindset and mentality of what it takes to go after these big bucks. So go ahead and head over to YouTube, give us a like, give us a follow. If you like what we're doing here at the podcast, you're going to love what we're doing over there. So jumping into this episode for today, I am so pumped for this. We have another terrain series special coming to you, and we're going to cover hill country. And we have Greg Kazmierski of Whitetail Partners with us. And man, this guy is a wealth of knowledge. He really laid down a lot of great tips for anybody who's looking to go to hill country this year during the rut. This is an episode you do not want to miss. And mentioned this a few times in the podcast, but go over to Greg's Instagram account and just check out what he's got going on over there. He's got a ton of information and content, and really just not focused on hill country, but all things deer hunting. And I think it's something that you will love. So let's not waste any more time and get into the podcast. All right, Greg, thanks for answering the call and joining us on the dojo. I put out like kind of a survey on different terrain, just saying, hey, who do you know that has like a high level knowledge of different terrain, and you know, shoot me your number one guys. And so I got a list of them, and your name came up a couple times actually. And so, you know, we didn't know each other prior to this, so reaching out, I really appreciate you just saying, yeah, man, I'll jump on, man. That was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I felt really honored, honestly, that there's actually guys that said that, because I really do enjoy sharing content to try to help people out, and just to actually see people have a response like that and put my name out there. I was more than happy to come on. I always love talking about deer and anything, especially in the hills. It's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I can see that you do love putting out information, because I went and looked at, you know, your Instagram profile, obviously, and dude, you put out some really good stuff actually. And I did download your, like, you have like a topo ebook you can sign up for.
Yep. Yeah. I put that together for guys, and yeah, just a general overview on kind of how to read topo maps, what I'm looking for in topo maps, and integrating it with Onyx, and just how I kind of use that app to get the most out of topo maps.
Yeah, it was really good. I downloaded it actually and
Awesome.
went through it. And I suggest anybody else listening to this, if they want to know more about it, they should really go check out your Instagram. And in fact, why don't we just get that out of the way really quick? Where can people find you and some of your info?
Yeah, definitely most active on Instagram. My handle for that is just Greg_Whitetail_partners. And then if you wanted to contact me directly, you can either send me a DM or email that is greg@whitetailpartners.com. So either way, that's a good way to consume the content or get a hold of me.
Great. I really, if you're listening to this, go over there, even if it's not just hill stuff, because there's a variety of information there, and really consume it, because it was really good stuff. And I'm going to continue to do that. But the reason why I called you here today is that reason that we're going over different terrains as we're starting to get ready into the season. I think, you know, some guys probably have some out of state trips that they're planning and they're thinking about heading out. And for some people, one, they might not have a lot of experience in the hills. That's kind of where we'll focus some of our conversation today. And maybe even, you know, using topo maps. I mean, that's something I've had to like stumble through for, you know, a couple of years to kind of figure out myself. So I'm wondering if you could give us like, and this might be hard to do because this is a very big subject, but if you're going to talk to a guy who maybe has never gone out to hill country, or he might have gone a couple times and just isn't seeing the results that he was hoping to see, can you start to give them an overview of like, what should they be looking for? How can they use the map? That type of general conversation.
Yeah, I mean, for starters, just really understanding how that map lays out and just understanding what exactly those lines on the map mean and how they compare to what is the top of the hill, what is the bottom of the hill, and then all of those features in between will start to make sense from there. Anytime I'm looking at a topo map specifically, trying to learn an area, I find that there's five different features that I always look for, starting from the top down. If you can understand a saddle, a point, a bench, a drainage top, and a what I call a thermal hub, they have different names. If you can understand those five things and how deer use them, then I feel like you can really start to put the pieces together of how deer work their way through a specific ridge system. And anytime something might seem overwhelming, just try to break it down into smaller and smaller pieces until you understand it. So, understanding the features first will then allow you to understand what all of those features mean and how they relate together. And it actually caught my eye right from the moment we logged on here. Probably the best book I've ever read on topo maps is the one right over your right shoulder there, Mapping Trophy Bucks. That was a book that really changed everything for me, that got recommended by my bow hunting mentor. And I read that book and it changed a lot for me reading topo maps.
Yeah, and what's so nice now is I don't know if when this book came out that we had the ability to look at topo maps on our phone, but you can go through this and actually pull out your OnX and kind of compare what you're seeing in the book to what you see on the map. Yeah, it's really fun. I've been doing that, and even then, put it like on your desktop, put it in 3D mode, and
Yeah.
kind of compare to what the book says. But oh, that's awesome. So the five features there, and back me up if I'm going too far. Did those five features do they play different significance at different time of year?
Yeah, I would say at different times of year they're going to have different significance, but also depending on the situation of hunting pressure, what the food sources are for that area, where exactly the deer are bedded. There's so much that goes into it. It's just that I find that those five features are really good starting points, especially if you find yourself and I'm going on a week-long hunt in these hills. If I'm going to do something like that, these are the five features that I'm looking for to start out my time scouting in the woods before I'm actually setting up in a tree.
Okay. All right. Now, this might be hard to do considering that we're not actually sharing a map. I should have thought through that before I started the podcast, but can we kind of like walk through and try to generally try to explain some of these features and paint a picture in our listeners' head of what those
Yeah.
are? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a saddle is going to be just like a horse's saddle, where you have that low point in the middle and then the two higher points on each side. So, those higher points are going to be your hilltops, and it's going to be that slight depression that's going to be in the middle of the two hilltops. That's your saddle. Moving on to the point, a point is where a ridge system comes out to an actual point. Those points are typically places that I find buck beds, particularly in the hills. They seem to have a very good vantage point out there, and they are able to get good wind, and they also have a good visual. So bucks, I find them a lot of times on those points. The drainage or the ravine top, where you have the steep, usually associated with the creek, not always with water, but there's some sort of water where it all comes down and it's a very steep ravine. Right where that tops out in that first flat spot, that's what I'm referring to as a drainage top, and that's a really good pinch point for deer activity. Next, we have the bench, which a bench is hard sometimes to identify while looking on a map. But if you can picture just a street bench where you have your back that's straight down and then your flat spot where you would sit and then it drops down to the ground, that spot you sit is what you're looking for. So again, you might not be able to always find that on the map, but those are really good places to find deer cruising the edges of the hills. And then a thermal hub, that's going to be at the bottom of the hill. And again, this has different names. Some guys call it different things, but it's where all of those points and drainages where they all converge down into one area. So anytime that I have more than two separate points or drainages that converge down, that's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about a thermal hub.
Now, the thermal hub, that's almost like a buzzword over the last couple years. I mean, I think, Jake Bush really made that pretty
Hmm.
famous. I don't know if he's the only one that made it famous, but for me, honestly, that was the first time that I heard it was
Yeah.
when he was talking about it. I don't know If I should ask you, like, when you hunt, do you happen to go out on public land at all, or are you mainly on
Yeah,
private?
yeah. So I cut my teeth on public land growing up. That's all I hunted. And even now that I have opportunities to hunt private land, I find myself gravitating towards the public more often than not, just because of the sense of adventure, really, the
Mm.
unknowingness of what's out there. And I've started to get more intimate with a few of the pieces of public that I've hunted these last few years and really started to understand them. And honestly, the quality of bucks that I'm going after now on these pieces of property are in the same caliber as the deer that I'm going to be going after on these private land pieces.
Mm. That's awesome. I agree with you on. I love the sense of adventure too. Don't get me wrong. If I ever had a chance at a piece of private that had a nice buck on it, I'd go for it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
But so with the thermal hubs, I don't know if you've noticed or through your conversations with other hunters, have you noticed since that has become more popular to talk about if those are starting to get more pressure into those hubs and if anything is changing as far as, and that's a very situational question. The second part of it for sure is if you notice those are starting to get blown out a little bit.
Yeah, I can say I do notice that I get a lot more guys on my trail cameras down in thermal hubs now over these last few years than I did historically. So I don't know as far as how the actual pressure affects it, but I think just no different than this episode that we're recording right now. You know, people are going to listen to this, and if they're just getting into hill country hunting and they hear another guy talk about thermal hubs and like that's 4 or 5 people they've heard now, well, they're probably going to go out and check out a thermal hub. So I can't blame them because that's exactly what I want to do too. I want to go out in the hills and find where the deer are walking. And if everybody says they're in the thermal hubs, I'm going to go check those thermal hubs out. So I do think they became a lot more popular with the rise and how much content is out there. And there are guys that have a lot of success that talk very highly of them. So I have noticed that. And I think that with anything else, the deer are going to make adjustments on, especially on public land, based off of what people are doing. You know, when it's those times during hunting season and the majority of the people are out there, whether it's a thermal hub, a saddle, a point, or wherever it may be, if there's an increase in human activity, those deer are going to shift their movements accordingly to stay away from that human activity.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's all about getting creative on public land when the pressure starts going up, and then trying to think, if I were a deer with a lot of people trying to kill me, where would I go? And
Yeah.
yet, sometimes you have to get real creative with that and go into spots that you'd never think. But so, and with all these features, I think you might hear on other podcasts. I know I have, like, oh, the saddle's played out. Everybody knows about the saddle, but I don't know if that's always like, I don't really feel like that's always the case. These are great places to start because it's still going to get you closer than if you didn't use these pieces. And then again, then you just got to play off the pressure from each, point that you're looking at, right? So if you get there and the saddle has pressure on it, well then, how are the deer using that to go around the pressure? But going back to the different features, and one thing I'll say before we jump any further, go and get the ebook for sure, because you actually have pictures, very clear pictures and examples all in that book that's and that's a free book. You just
Yeah.
enter in your email and it
Email and
downloads.
download. Yep.
Yep. And it'll give you a really quick overview of everything we're talking about. When you're speaking of a drainage, do they come in different sizes? Are they like wide? Like, are they very small and narrow? Or I don't know. Can you paint that picture a little bit more? And then why does that filter deer? You said that it kind of funnels deer. Can you
Yep.
explain why they do?
Yep. So when I'm looking for a drainage top that I'm targeting, it's going to be at the top of a drainage ravine, holler, depending on where you are, it's going to be called different things, but it's going to be edges that are very steep on each side, leading from some point of underneath the top of the hill all the way towards the base. And these drainages will either run into the base of the ridge, down into a hub, into a larger creek system, whatever it may be. So it's basically where over time the accumulation of all of the water runoff has worn away at the land and it's created these steep edges. So It's not to say that the deer won't go down and up these steep edges, because I've seen deer do crazy things in the hills. They're like we kind of just touched on, they're going to go where the people aren't. And if that's where it takes them, they'll go there. But I'm not willing to base my strategy off of something that might only happen once in the 3 month hunting period. That's just not something I want to do. So if I can go and identify the tops of these drainages, which sometimes, depending on where you are, like some places I hunt in southern Ohio, you have a few 100 feet of elevation of very steep ravine. And then at the very top, that's your first easy crossing point. So when you start talking about like going on a rut hunt out of state for your first time, if I can go and find a drainage top, that's likely going to be where I'm going to see at least some sort of cruising activity, because it's the easiest elevation point for a few 100 feet below that. And that's like the first spot. So when you go in the mindset of I want to think like a deer, if a buck is out running through these hills, I mean, you know from anytime you're in the hills, it can be tiring and it can wear on you. So if they're doing that all day long for weeks on end, they're going to gravitate towards what's going to conserve the most energy, because that's what their goal is at that time of the season.
And then, so how are deer using the saddles, or why do deer use saddles when they're maneuvering through the land?
Yeah, so very similar to what you have with the drainage tops, where it's the easiest path of travel to get from one side of the ridge to the other. So if you have those two hilltops, it'll change depending on where you are, but very similar to what you said about these ravines. You get this rocky outcrop maybe on the hilltops, and it just doesn't make a much logical sense for a deer to go up and over the hilltop. It makes a lot more sense for them to go right through the middle of it. So you mentioned it at the very beginning about how saddles could be played out. And one thing I like to take note on and make point of is that even if the saddle itself could or is played out, whatever it is, based off the hunting pressure in your area, that is still relevant, because that's still the easiest path to travel. So even if a deer isn't traveling through that saddle until well after dark, not during shooting hours, you still know that at some point in time they are going to use that saddle. So that's where I start to backtrack and reverse engineer and say, okay, if they're going to be using the saddle at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, well, where are they going to be at 6 o'clock when I can actually be hunting them in the tree? So you can still use those features, even if it's not specifically somewhere you're going to go out and set up and hunt.
I love you said reverse engineer. Like that, that's a great term to use for really anytime you find sign, right? Like
Yeah.
reverse engineering, why am I seeing this here? And then trying to figure out when is it here? And then you're right. If the pressure's there, and that means that sign's coming later, then yeah, walking it back, figuring out, okay, where can I set up before they reach here?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where you can start to stack these features on top of each other. And if you can start in that saddle, and this is where scouting is so valuable. Scouting is always valuable, but just putting boots on the ground in hill country, there's just nothing that really compares to that, because that's generally what I do is I like to start with these general points of interest like a saddle, and I'll start in that saddle, and then that's when I begin to reverse engineer and say, okay, how would a deer get to here from wherever this is out in front of me? Because I know they live out here somewhere. And then you can start piecing that together. And I'll backtrack as far as I have to until I find that opportunity that I feel like is going to give me a high odds hunting scenario. So that's where you try to find the more narrow, condensed paths of travel, which is a step beyond what these main topo features I'm looking for are.
Yeah, I feel like I need to do a lot of boots on the ground when I'm looking for the drainage, for the drainages. Like there's some you can see on the map because they've got like a dashed water line kind of going down them. But I tend to find a lot of drainages that they don't actually show up on the map, or if they do, it's a very subtle change in the line. It kind of goes back just, I mean, a hair. It doesn't really show it. And that's actually some of the drainages that I like the most, because they're very like jagged and just they tend to kind of filter, at least in my experience, they kind of are moving the deer more to the top. But do you find that, this is for my own personal, not wanted to verify if I'm finding it the right way, but do you find that when you're looking for a drainage top that sometimes
Yeah.
they're not showing up on the topo?
Yeah, definitely. Those are actually like some of my favorite places to go and try to hunt. I like to call it, like, my term for those would be like a micro feature where it exists and it's a drainage, but almost unless you physically went out and found that drainage and then looked at the map, it would be very easy to overlook. And one thing that you can kind of look for that I've found to be helpful, like I find those micro drainage tops, they exist more in areas where there's some sort of logging that gets done, because when they go out there and they bring in all of that heavy equipment and they remove the root systems of these trees, it starts to shift that earth around and then it creates washouts. Well, it's going to create a washout in those little mini drainages. So those washouts aren't as severe as those 400 foot sections, but even if it's a 50-foot section, you're still getting a very defined point of travel, and then you can start piecing together all of these pinch points.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the ones that are like 50 to 100 foot is like the drainages I tend to gravitate towards. And
Yeah.
honestly, this is where I'm at. It's not huge hill country either, so I don't get those huge drainages, So they tend to be
Hmm.
smaller. But so moving on to points, this one I'd like to sit on for a little bit, I think, because I hear a lot about them. I think most listeners, even if you've never gone out to hill country, by now you've heard that bucks bet on points. How are you seeing Bucks use these points for betting?
Yeah, so I see them that they'll be used a little bit differently depending on, again, the scenario for it. That end point is always a good place to start, somewhere. Okay, I'll drop my POI pin right here and I'll start walking around. But where exactly I find bucks bedded on the point is going to vary. Typically, I do find the majority of the buck beds on points was some sort of back cover. So whether that be a boulder, some sort of rocky outcrop, a blowdown, or anything like that, those are the things that I'm specifically looking for if I'm going to walk out onto a point and try to identify an actual buck bed. Because I find that they like to bet on those points when they get the wind blowing over top of their back and then they can overlook the bottom. And if they can tuck in and have that back cover, that's just that extra layer of security for them with that wind blowing over their back, knowing nothing's going to be able to see them if they do come up over top of that edge.
Are you seeing beds are on the sides of the points as well, just depending on the dominant wind for the area?
Yep, it'll depend. And like what I feel that a lot of times, like, one buck can use a point to bed, and if it's the right setup, he can bed on that same point for all of the different like core winds of that area. So if I go out onto a point and I find, two or three different beds, well, that could be from that same deer. He might just be on the north side with the south wind, or vice versa with the north wind, or it depends too on the time of the year and if it's cold out, if he wants to be on that southerly facing slope for the sun exposure or whatever it may be. So I do find that it's not only just right on the point, it can kind of shift. And that's where you just kind of have to investigate the area and see exactly what's going on. And if you can find those beds, then again, you can go back to the reverse engineering and figure out why would he be bedded here? Okay, it's south facing, so he wants to bed here when it's cold out, or okay, it's on this point and he's going to come when there's this wind. And then you can start to figure out this is when he's going to be using this bed.
With benches, then you talked about that being a travel route for deer.
Mm-hmm.
Why does a bench draw their attention for travel?
In my mind, it's just that bench is the flattest area on a relatively steep hillside, and that's just going to allow them to get from point A to point B, conserving the most amount of energy. So a lot of times, if you go back into an area that was cut within the last however many years, those benches are typically going to be associated with an old logging road of where they drove their equipment down. So that is going to not only be a flat area, but it's also going to be an area that doesn't have any vegetation growing on it. Or if it does, it's going to be growing up on the edges. So it's easy in the sense of a lower stem count, but they can be surrounded by security cover. And it's easy in the sense of it's a flat place for them to walk and not have to burn so much energy walking on the side of a hill.
Do you ever see deer bed on benches at all?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. If there's not a lot of pressure around, for sure, it's definitely some. I don't find like I find more predominant like buck beds on those points, and that's the main spot I find a lot of mine. But they'll definitely still bed on benches, and in the right scenario, they could have a primary bedding setup on a bench. No doubt about that.
So, and I think we've covered all of that now that we've got a general idea of like how deer are using these pieces. What I was wondering if we could walk through how these pieces look through different times of the year. And I'm probably going to start around the rut because a lot of people plan that rutcation. This is,
Mhm.
and they're going to go, maybe to Ohio for the first time and try to use that. So in the rut, I guess, can you walk us through and maybe tie these things together a little bit? Like, where would you go, or where would you tell a guy to start if he's heading out for the rut for rutcation for 1 week? Where should he start his focus?
Yeah, I think the most important place to start is asking yourself what exactly it is that you like to hunt. I think that people can get caught up in trying to go to the place that they think they're going to have success based off of what they heard online. But if that doesn't line up with your style, your gear, just what you like to look at when you're sitting in a tree, you're not going to be engaged into the hunt. And if you're not engaged in the hunt, you're probably not going to have success. But when you go beyond that and you start looking at it from a more like tactive type perspective, that's where anytime I go out on whether it's out of state or a new piece of public that I don't have a lot of experience with, and I'm just dropping waypoints on these main features and I'll just start walking. And, we're in a era now with, especially with a lot of guys that are listening to this podcast, that mobile gear is very lightweight. It's very easy to carry around on your back and you can just start logging the miles and you can find I'm marking those points and I'm walking around until I find any kind of intense higher deer activity, whether that be sign or actually visually seeing deer running or whatever that may be. I'm not really stopping on a rut trip until I find out exactly where the deer are actually at, basically.
And you just made me feel really good because that's the technique that I've adopted over the last few years. I do the same thing. Like I'm just going to keep
Yeah.
going until I actually lay eyes on deer, and then or then I'm going to set up and kind of make my game plan off of that. I need to back up a little bit because I think I've been focused really hard on the topo. But is there anything else that you would suggest someone do before? Like, is there any, like, should they be looking at something else, aerial maps or anything like that before they actually go out, besides just finding these pieces on the topo map?
I mean, there can be. I think a topo map is going to be like your best resource, but if you're looking at any kind of satellite imagery, if it's updated and you have any idea on like if you're in a big wood setting, has there been any logging cuts done here recently that I know that that could be a food source, so that's probably where the deer are going to be. So, because a saddle, a drainage top, any of these features is going to be a lot more effective if you're close to a newer logging cut because in the big woods, that's what your ag field is. So I would just look at all of the outside factors that would affect deer movement to the best that you can. And whether that be looking at satellite imagery, contacting local foresters, there's a lot of different resources that you can use. It just depends how much legwork do you want to put into the front end to put yourself in the right spot once you do get boots on the ground.
I almost forgot to. I wanted to thank you for saying like finding something that fits your style so that you're engaged. And I'm a firm believer this podcast is not just a hunting podcast, but we're definitely a mindset and a personal development podcast. So I love the idea of pressing yourself and challenging yourself. I don't know if you should always do that on your first trip out, you know, and getting into a familiar area, even if you're going into different terrain. I do agree. Like enjoy the hunt. That's the most
Yeah.
important thing. And I'm with you 100%, even though I'm talking tactics today and trying to help guys kind of get on that, that buck. It is about enjoying the process and having fun. And I think we do get lost in this whole, I have to go out and kill a big buck because I saw, 10 guys today on Instagram that had big bucks. I'm actually not a believer in that. I'm all for challenging yourself to go after something if it means that you're developing more skills. But so thanks for saying that, man. You're like the first person to ever say that on the podcast. So
Yeah,
it was
yeah, I'm
good.
I'm I'm big into that, and like I love the process end of it so much more than the result. And so it's like the result is just effect of what comes from the process at this point. And being blessed with the opportunity to do this beyond just personally and just being able to help people improve their properties as well. Like, I love the process so much that I've learned that there is so much more to this than just filling that tag. And when you speak on like personal development, it's such a great way to constantly challenge yourself, to constantly learn and just honestly become a better person going out there and using this in your free time. It's such a great activity to do all of that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it's funny too, because like you may have said it directly, but every one of the, we'll call them like big killers that I've interviewed on here, these guys who are just crazy successful, that's actually their viewpoint on it.
Hmm.
Like they take this more like enjoying the process, development type of thing, and then the outcome ends up being these bigger, more mature bucks. But I don't know if that's the full driving force. It's more of the whole thing. But everybody's heard me say that probably a million times on this podcast. So, but I want to thank you for it. But
Yeah.
so going in, I guess if we're still talking rut, how are bucks using hill country, the ridges? How are they maneuvering that terrain, and why are they moving that way?
Yeah, so the main topo features that I covered earlier, those are going to be areas that are in some way, shape, or form typically going to be associated with a pinch point. A pinch point is anywhere that I can narrow down deer activity. When we're talking about bucks chasing does during the rut or looking for does during the rut, I have the highest odds of seeing a buck in a pinch point because it's a condensed area of activity. So during these rut time periods, the bucks are going to want to spend as much time as possible from what I just call them doe social areas, whether that's doe bedding or doe feeding. Those are the two places that does are going to spend the most time in a stagnant position. And so if I know where the does are bedding and the does are feeding, then I can start to find these pinch points that are going to be traveled by these bucks while they're seeking out all of those does. So ideally, in a perfect world, I'm spending a majority of my time actually in the tree hunting during the rut, right in a some sort of pinch point.
Hmm. Can we walk through and discuss setups on some of these pinch points, some of these features that you talked about?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So is it, well, and I guess I don't know, are all of these during the rut, are all of these features actually places that you would hunt, or is there a few of them that stand out to you?
Yeah, so myself personally, out of the what I listed, drainage tops and benches are going to be the two that I focus on during the rut. Things like a saddle, point, and hub, those are used to just gather information for myself during scouting sessions or just to get a better idea of what's going on in the area. So these drainage chops and these benches, those are like the two from that list that I actually focus on hunting during the rut. And to take it just a little bit further, I'm trying to find areas where these pinch points come down from where I think that bucks will be walking. So I want to make sure that these pinch points are associated with those doe social areas, ideally on the downwind side of them. So that way the buck is able to walk through this pinch point while scent checking that doe social area.
And you said the social area, you talked about feeding, and what was is that bedding?
Bedding, yep.
Yep.
Just the two areas that doe groups are going to be stagnant. So whether they're feeding or eating, that's where the two areas they're going to consistently spend the most time. So that's what I'm referring to when I say social area.
So on a bedding, does, and this is going to be situational as well, it always is, but what does bedding look like for does? Do they use points the same way that bucks do, or are they using different features or cover?
I think that they can use points, but what I typically find from these doe groups is they bed a lot closer to the primary food sources. So, like using the cutting as an example again, doe groups are going to either bed potentially right in the cutting or very close to that cutting. It seems like the doe group, since they bed typically in a group, a larger number of them, they have safety in numbers, so they can be more vulnerable in the sense of bedding closer to the food where those bucks, especially the older they get, a lot of times they like to isolate themselves from the herd. And that's why they kind of put themselves out on the point. Like you think about like the Grinch, like the Grinch lived up out on the top of this old gnarly mountain. And it's like that's kind of like what the buck does. He just stopped liking other people. And in this case, he stopped liking other deer. So he just kind of went to where the other deer aren't hanging out all the time.
Yeah, oh, that's an awesome visual. What happens if the food might be ag still up is down in the bottom? And so you have a ridge system and now you have an ag source, food source down at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Do the does still use that ridge? Are they still bedding up there and then heading down towards the ag? Or do you find them kind of more in the bottom at that time?
I think it'll depend. Like when we're talking about, which a lot of this is going to be centered around is a public land trip. We're going to be hunting on public land, and if there's something as obvious as an ag as the primary food source, a destination food source, I think that you can expect the deer not to be bedded right on the edge of an ag field by the time November gets here, because you're definitely not the first person that's hunted out there. So I would take that. I would always take that into mind when we're talking about something as obvious as the ag being the destination, because just like we talked about with they might not use that saddle till 11 p.m. Well, they're probably not going to get out to that ag field in November until the middle of the night. So that's again, you just start backtracking and trying to find where I find that doe groups like to bed in the first best cover adjacent to that primary food source. So, in a private land setting, that literally might be right on top of or in within the food source, depending on what that is. On public land, you have to start backing that up farther and farther, depending on the factors like hunting pressure and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's where the ridge actually becomes that cover because, if you look at the flat part and if that's open woods, they're not bedding, especially with pressure, right? Just like you were saying. They're not going to be bedded down there. So now the ridge, even if the ridge is open itself, it still has the features of being able to hide behind the edge or some downfall, and you have the wind. You can play it in many different ways. So now if the food's on top, if the ag's on top, same thing, right? You just work it backwards because a lot of the pressure is going to be on top. And so then you're backtracking and reverse engineering, where's the
Yep.
next area of cover for them.
Yep.
Uh,
Exactly.
okay. From what I've experienced, and I don't hunt really big ridge systems. These are smaller ridge systems in Illinois, Indiana, but not the
Mm-hmm.
big ones in Indiana. I've seen them, kind of bed to the top on areas where they have a lot of thick, overgrown briar. Where I tend to hunt in some of these ridges, which kind of shocked me when I first started hunting ridges, is I would go scout early season and the sides were just thick. And, I'm like, wow, this place is a wild jungle. And I came back in November and I almost lost everything, like lost myself because I got there and now I can see every ridge all the way across on the sides and it's like wide open. And where I
Mm-hmm.
thought the deer were going to be on the sides, they're actually ended up on top. And now it's like you had what you were talking about is where the cover is. So even if that cover's on the side or if it's on top, those are where the does are probably going to position themselves in a circle, be able to smell and see in every direction and use
Yep.
that as cover. Do you
Yeah.
disagree or agree or
No, I agree with that completely. Yeah, you pretty much nailed it.
so okay. So now that we've kind of identified where these does are stationary, how would you use a drainage top? How would you set up on a drainage top to target a buck?
Yeah, so my personal favorite approach when hunting drainage tops is being able to access directly up, like what you referred to as that blue dash line when it shows up on the map. I like to walk right up the heart of that ravine, that drainage, and get right to the top. What I've found, especially like where I am, where it is steeper and those ravines are a big drop off, there's a very strong pull of thermals very early in the day that sucks right down those ravines, those drainages, especially if there is water in there. It seems like that's a very strong pull. So, not saying that that is easy because by no means is it. And a lot of times I have everything strapped on my back and I'm going out there with my hiking trekking poles and using that to navigate up these drainages because it's very difficult. It's a steep climb. I keep myself in good good shape year round so I can make sure I can do things like that. Because if you just tried to walk out there in the middle of November with some gear on your back and you're not in very good shape, it's going to be tough to do. But I like to walk right up to the top, right where it becomes flat. And I like to hunt the first tree right on the edge of where it becomes flat. So sometimes, you're behind you where that tree drops down, it's right down that ravine where it gets steep. So I think the closer you can get to that, the better for a couple of reasons. One, you're not leaving any ground scent in the areas where the deer are spending the most time, but also you have your thermals that are going to get yanked right back down that drainage right where you just walked from. And then you're just both ground scent and air scent. It's all undisturbed out in front of you. So then on top of that, I just want to make sure that that drainage top, that system is somewhere where I think those deer are going to be. So that's again where like the scouting and stuff comes in. If you have the ability to do that, if you spent more time out there and like, okay, well, right on the other side of this hill, I have a doe bedding area, or there's a nice oak flat over there. There could be a chance that there are some does hanging out in there, then that's probably pretty likely that that ridge top is going to get some sort of buck activity.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you can find even like a leaf off aerial photo of that ridge system that you're hunting, if you don't have time to go there prior to scouting, you can find some of the thicker areas where you can guess. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but you can guess that that's a thicker area on that ridge. There's possibly going to be bedding, to my east. Now I've got another thicker area over to my west. And now you can imagine bucks, traveling back and forth there. The other thing I would say is if you have to go walk it, like it's the
Yeah.
rut, get in there, just go find out if that's bedding or not and come back later to that spot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then the other thing about like these drainage shops too is that they're just areas that if say a doe is either just about ready to enter in her cycle and get bred and she's being chased, or she's not ready yet and she's being pushed around, like those are places that they're more likely to get pushed into, because if they're in that frantic state and they're being chased around, they're not going to want to go down that ravine and up the other side, because just like the bucks are looking for the easiest route to cruise, they're looking for the easiest route to get away from those bucks. And I've had trail cameras on pinch points like a drainage top before, and you can get a doe come through and then you could get 5 to 6 bucks run past that camera in the same exact path for the rest of that day.
Mm.
It's just like that's once that hot doe is located, like all eyes are on her, because typically in hill country it's associated with bigger timber, and in bigger timber you have a lower deer density, so it's like there's not as many does out there in the first place, so there's even less does that are going to be ready to be bred during that specific time whenever it is that you're hunting. So generally it makes the bucks a lot more aggressive.
Mm. Do you ever find sign at the top of those drainage points or those drainage tops?
Yeah, I think I find scrapes up there a lot. Those are another great place I really enjoy to run trail cameras, is at scrapes on the tops of these drainages. You can find some rubs, and I'm not saying I don't hold weight in rubs, but I like scrapes for trail camera purposes just because it's more of a social type of activity compared to those rubs. I hold a lot more weight in rubs when I'm out scouting in the off season. So I focus on anytime I can find like a bigger, more what I call like a primary scrape, where it's something that more than one deer is using on more than one occasion.
Yeah. I feel like if I'm going in blind and I come up and I check a drainage top and I see a scrape and I don't have the ability, I'm there for 5 days. I'm not going to run a bunch of cameras right now. That's something where I'll feel like it puts some weight on it for me to make a sit there,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
especially if you get up there, and I guess it depends on when you go. I mean, if you're going pre-rut and it's fresh, I mean, it's money, but even if it's
Yeah.
not fresh and it looks like it's been worked over and it's bigger, then I'm like, okay, it's worth the sit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So going back to the setup there, the wind, do you have wind in face? Because I know you have the thermal pull. Do you ever rely on that pull and let the wind be actually at your back going over the ridge, or do you always have the wind in your face as you're watching that pinch point right there?
So it doesn't always have to be in my face, but I do want that wind to be coming in a direction from where I think those does are spending a lot of their time. So because I think that like in that sense, especially if like you can bump it up a little before the rut when it's just pure chaos and the bucks are kind of still acting systematically and they're trying to check all of these social areas one after the other and they're using all of these features like the drainage tops. I want I want that drainage top to be positioned downwind of that doe area. So I'll use my thermals to get away with a little bit more than I think I typically could based off of that wind. But rarely in that scenario would there be bedding where I would have wind coming directly over my back. You know what I'm saying? It would be,
Yep.
but that's not to say it's not coming directly over my left or my right shoulder. It could be doing something like that. And then that's where I'm entering into that more marginal wind where I'm like right on the edge. It's like, man, if he comes there, I'm good. But if he's there, I might be in trouble kind of thing. So I definitely use it to get away with a lot more than I typically would.
Yeah, for sure. I should have asked you, like, when is the best time period if you had to? I guess it depends on where you're at, but let's just say it's Ohio. If you're hunting Ohio, when is the best time period to use a drainage top? Do you have like a date plan?
I, I think in a general sense, if you're just looking to go out there and fill a tag, I think that it's hard to beat those places in like the 5th to 12th of November. Very, very good. But if you're somebody like me that's spending a lot more time out there, man, that last week of October on the right drainage top, when we were looking at those scrapes that we're talking about, pretty like October 28th to like November 2nd, 3rd. That's a really sweet window where I feel you have a chance to lay a tag on a really nice buck. And just this last year, I had one buck because let me kind of back up a little bit here. The drainage top that I like to focus on in like that pre-rut period, it's generally associated with where those drainages come out. They lead out to buck bedding points. So I'll access up the drainage, and my goal is to try to get that buck when he's coming off of his point, hitting that scrape, and then going and doing whatever he wants to do. And there's been a buck I've been chasing around on one of these pieces of public for the last few years, and he's just an absolute stud now. And last year, I missed him by a day 2 times based off of trail camera data. I don't get good cell signal where I was hunting, so it was a non-cell cam. I didn't check it till after season, but I hunted on the 31st and the 2nd, and he was in front of that trail camera on the 1st and the 3rd. So it was right, just like literally, you can't get closer. So I personally like that before things get chaotic. But if you're looking at just from like a pure odds perspective, just putting yourself there in the middle of the peak chasing time, that's a very good spot to be.
Oh, that's awesome. So, anything else about drainages that you want to cover in regards to that time period?
I think that's pretty good. Yeah, I think that covers a lot of my ideas behind them.
So, how about benches? How are you setting up on benches during that time?
Yeah, so typically with benches, it'll depend on whether I'm hunting in the morning or in the evening. And then this is where you have to take that next step, and it's based off of what access I have. I'm not just going to access from the top just because I'm supposed to access from the top in the morning. Like if there are deer up on the top when I'm accessing, then I don't want to access from up there. So same with the bottom. But I want to get either above or below the bench. In the morning, I want to be above, and in the evening, I want to get below because of that thermal rise up in the morning or that thermal pull down in the evening. And I want my scent to be carried either below or above that deer. So that way, when they're using that bench, ideally they're not really getting onto me in my position. So from a general setup perspective, those are the two main factors I'm looking at when setting up on a bench.
So, with the thermal pulls in the morning and evening, I was shocked the first time I went out. I'm like, okay, cool. In the morning, my thermals are gonna rise up, and I get out there and I'm sitting there and my thermals are just pulling down. They're pulling down. They're pulling down. And I'm like, well, this isn't working out the way I wanted it to work out. And all of a sudden it's like, it's 9 o'clock and they're still pulling down on this particular ridge. And then 9:30, I all of a sudden the milkweed starts to go in the other direction. And by then I blew out a couple deer. I got deer blowing at me and I was like, wow, it doesn't just happen right away. So am I on the wrong ridge at that time? Like what's going on with that scenario right there?
Yeah, it sounds like it probably was associated with when the sun was hitting that ridge system. And like once it starts heating up the ground, that's when the thermal started to rise. So like that'll happen a lot when you're on the northern ridges. So I guess one more thing back to like drainage tops. I like to do drainage tops on the northern ridges because I usually do those in the afternoons and it'll be shaded on that northern side earlier. So that thermal is going to start to pull down because the ground is now cooling. So very same with just a bench where if you're on that southern side and it's getting sun exposure sooner, then you're going to have that ground heat up and then those thermals are going to start to rise. And this is all general. Like if we're talking 101, that's a very base sense because you can go out there and you can have a situation like you experience where it's like, wait a minute, this isn't what is supposed to happen. And sometimes you just have to figure that out. But instead of looking at it like you messed up or this is a problem, figure out now how can I use this to my advantage because now you just gave yourself the answer for how deer are going to work through that area. So maybe you found that bench and the thermals didn't rise until 9:30. Well, now you know you can come up from the bottom. And if you access the bottom and you only hunt until 9:30 before getting out of that area, that could be your window where you go out there and fill your tag.
Yeah, exactly. It's always reversing engineering, like you talked
Yeah.
about, the information that you're getting. I feel like hill country is one of those things where it can sound prescriptive, but it really is like you have to go out there and mess up and learn these. Like thermals are a funky thing. The way the
Yeah.
winds run through each ridge system is different. I've got a ridge system in Illinois that I mean, on most winds, unless it's a south wind, it ends up being a west wind where I'm
Hmm.
hunting. And so, it may be calling for an east wind, but when I get in there, for whatever reason, the way these fingers roll out, it typically ends up kind of swirling around and coming back to the west. And so that's the kind of information you can only really learn by being in that spot.
Yep.
And it's frustrating when you only have a week and maybe you've never been there, but I think that's when you're like logging that information away for next year too, you
Yeah,
know?
log it away from next year. The other thing that I've found very helpful is like when I do these types of trips, which I'm sure a lot of guys, a lot of times you're doing it with either a small group or a decent sized group of guys. And, going back to like the mindset thing, surrounding yourself with people that are like-minded in the sense of going out and trying to be successful in the woods. If you surround yourself with your rut group and it's all guys that are trying to learn, man, you can break down the hills a heck of a lot faster than if you're doing a solo rut trip. Like me and the few guys that I do my trips with, that's kind of our approach. We'll go out there and we'll kind of all split up and hunt like a different set of features and then we'll just talk about it back at camp of like this is what I learned, this is what the wind said, and it's like breaking down all of those different elements and finding out if there are any consistencies in either the weather patterns or what the deer are doing. And then it's like your input's just 3x compared to what you'd be doing if you're by yourself. And then you take that for your rut trip this year. Now, if you guys come back the next year, you're going to be so much further ahead on day one of year two than you are on day one of year one, whether you're by yourself or with a group of guys.
Yeah, 100%. I hunted solo for so long and I really wish I would have found a group that was like-minded
Mm-hmm.
because I went so many years without ever being able to run different scenarios off anybody else, and
Yeah.
I, and it honestly wasn't until like podcasts started coming out and like Instagram where I started meeting other people who were like-minded I was able to do that, but I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
So back to the bench system again. So anything else about the setup there and or even like is that more active at different times of day during the rut or does it not really matter?
I think it matters depending on like what that bench is relating to. So kind of like what we talked about with the drainage top, there being a reason that that buck's traveling there. What's the reason for that buck using that bench other than it just being like the easiest path of travel, and well, I guess one thing that like I like to look for in a bench is maybe not that bench that's 300 yards long, but can I find that bench that's only 50 yards long or 75 yards long, something that's not so long, so that way I know that there's a very limited area where they can come onto and exit off of that bench. So my opportunity window is so much narrower than on that 300 yard long bench.
Yeah, because they can exit and go to different locations
Correct.
on
Yep.
that longer one. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
So those are the two primary areas that you're focusing. I think we hear a lot that bucks travel, one third down on the ridge, and they're kind of running the ridges back and forth looking for, doe, trying to downwind side, trying to catch the scent. Is that a general rule of thumb, or I mean, what is your experience on where on the ridge bucks are going to be running if you're not taking into consideration like a drainage point or something like that? Is that something that the guy can bank on? Hey, I'm going to go focus and set up on a run that's one third down from the top, or should they go, you need to be looking for more than that?
So I think that something like that, like a foundation, can be learned over multiple years of hunting an area because I find it different from one place to the next, whether they're running that one third or two thirds or whatever it may be, in the sense of where you want to be on a ridge. If I'm just going in there for a short rut style hunt, ideally, I want to try to find a ridge where there's a limited amount of opportunity for the buck to travel across that ridge system. So if it's just a flat, featureless ridge and they can go anywhere along the whole thing, then I really don't want to focus my limited amount of time on something like that. Whereas if there's only, say, like two or three different points where they can travel through that ridge, now you can, especially like with the map, say if you walk that ridge system and say, okay, he can go through here, here, or here. Well, now you can draw a line and figure out, well, here's all the places that he's probably going to walk along this ridge system. And now is it make more sense to go on the top third or the bottom third or whatever that may be. And so ideally, in a short term scenario, I'm trying to find those more feature dense ridge systems. And whether that be the obvious differences in the contour lines or things like rocky outcrop or whatever that may be, it can be different, but just trying to piece together those feature dense ridge systems.
Yeah, I had a feeling you were going to answer it that way. That's why I asked the question. 'Cause, I think we hear prescriptive, like this is where you should focus. And then if you're not taking in the other elements and building like a strong case for being in that spot, I think you could spend a lot of time sitting in these general areas and not seeing a lot. And when you said like a featureless ridge system, what I'm thinking is all you're doing is you really take that featureless slope and flatten it out. Now you're just hunting flat, big woods, is essentially what you're
Mm-hmm.
doing. That slope really doesn't give you any advantage because they can move at any point. It's the same resistance up top as it is the bottom. And really just depending on where pressure is and how things lay out, it's really hard to figure out if you're not having these other features to kind of, like you said, pinch the buck into a specific location. You could be
Yeah,
sitting a long time on a ridge and not
yeah,
see a thing.
yeah, absolutely. I started out hunting in Ohio. I grew up in Michigan and I would travel down to Ohio all of the time, whether it be off-season scouting or during the season. And it was a 5 hour car ride one way. And the whole time down, this was when I was really new into the public land hunting space. I would listen to podcasts and I would learn from all of these guys who were continuously having success. And they would preach things like that. And at the beginning, I thought, okay, I can just go down onto this piece of public. I'll hunt the top third and I'm going to be okay. Or I'm going to go scout the top third. There's going to be deer sign everywhere. Well, you can only scout or hunt a place like what you hear on a podcast so many times and not have any kind of success until you're like, I got to do something different because you'll just drive yourself crazy. So, I also use those 5 hour car rides to start doing things like this, like problem solving. And that's when I realized that the things that I hear from people on podcasts are meant to be nothing more than tidbits of information of how I can apply them to my individual situation, my approach, because that piece of land that the guy on the podcast is hunting is not the piece of land that I'm hunting. So therefore, my approach can't be a cookie cutter one. It has to be something that adapts to what exactly it is that I'm looking for.
Man, you just nailed it. That is what you said is the reason why I talk about mindset and development more, like even over tactics. This series is I don't know if it's tactical. I think it is in nature. We're talking about how to do setups and where to focus and stuff like that. But majority of the time, I try to talk about mindset and
Mm-hmm.
personal development because what you just said, I agree with 100%. It seems odd coming from a podcast host, but we talk about these things and they're just really, it doesn't line up for you because it's not you. Like the general ideas of nuggets that you need to take and then morph to your situation and who you are and your style and what your goals are. And I used to kind of go in and just kind of take the prescription and go set up. And I was so disappointed until I started to realize like, no, I need to develop myself, develop my mindset, and then kind of take control of these bits of information for myself. So that's why we talk the way we talk on the dojo. That's why we focus on development and mindset, because I believe those things are actually going to have you end up killing more deer than just listening to tactics and
Yeah.
stories about guys killing bucks. We do that stuff because it's great to
Yeah.
hear. It's great to
Oh,
take
yeah.
in. Yeah. All right, man. I said I wasn't going to talk much on this, and I find I'm talking way too much. It's just because I really love the information. I love your mindset
Yeah.
too. So sorry about that.
No worries.
So we've kind of covered those features during the rut. Is there anything about, or even pre-rut, is there anything more to say about that time period? Maybe it's something that we haven't touched on, or any other features that you might want to touch on for that time period.
Man, I think if there's anything during that time period, or this can go for really any phase of the season, but I obviously a lot of guys are going to be doing it during this time frame of back to those little small micro features. It doesn't always have to be that micro drainage chop. It can be just a weird point in the general topography of the side of a ridge. A good example is a place that I found this off season. It's a ridge system that I've scouted heavily for years, hundreds and hundreds of miles of boots on the ground here, whether it be hunting, scouting, whatever it may be. And I never saw this little feature on the map. I never came across it. And the only reason I came across it is because I found one side of a deer's shed and I was looking for the other side and I followed where he was walking. And that was the only reason I came out to this. And once I came out to this point, it's just this nice little flat spot where it's probably 25 yards by 25 yards. But when you look at the map, at the topo map, there is no flat area there. But this is a flat enough area. And lo and behold, right in this 25 by 25 circle, there's a massive car hood scrape and it's right underneath of a buck bedding point. So it's like, I just found a spot that I know I'm going to hunt in the early part of the season. Like that's what I look for all year long. That's what I've spent hundreds of miles trying to find. And I could not find that looking at a map. I couldn't find it after looking out here for years and I just happened to stumble across it. So don't ever get discouraged if you are looking at a topo map and you don't find what you're looking for. Just be confident just going out there and walking around and like being optimistic about what you may find because it could happen at the time that you really least expect it to. And that's exactly what happened here. And I can say that that one location is the place that I'm most excited to have a setup in this fall is that spot that I just referenced.
Yeah, I say this to myself. I think curiosity kills. Like that's what I'm finding out. There was last year there's a big talk about being efficient with scouting. I'm doing this so I can get really efficient. And I think there's value in that if you have limited time.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can actually just kind of get curious and wander around a little bit and start like those little things like, hey, I need to find this other antler, so I'm gonna head that way. Or sometimes for me, it's like this weird rub that's just in a weird location. I'm like, where in the past I would walk by it, like, it's a rub, whatever. Just keep going. And now I just get a little bit more curious, and all of a sudden I wander over there and whoa, what is this? And then it starts like things start to click, and you're like, I would have never saw this on a map. There's features I found that way, same thing. curiosity, I really think, is something people need to embrace and maybe move away a little bit from the efficiency of things and the prescription mindset of like, this is how you do it every time, and get curious and spend some time and wander
Yeah.
on a piece, man. You'll find a lot of
Yeah.
stuff you never thought you'd find.
Oh yeah, that's typically where I find the best stuff. It's always cool when you drop a waypoint on your Onyx before heading out and going to a place and you get there and you're like, "Oh yeah, this is probably the best spot here." But sometimes it's even cooler when you just stumble across something and you're like, "Whoa, wait a minute, this is like really cool."
Yeah, it does feel good though when you put a pen down and you get there and it's what
Yeah.
you thought it was. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah. Then you forget about the other 15 pens that you put
Right.
down that weren't
Yep.
nothing. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, that's so good. Hey, could you set like this might be tough too, because you don't know what people's skill set is, but let's just say they've never hunted the woods before, and or excuse me, not the woods, the hills. First trip expectation, first time coming out of a place where you don't hunt hills. Let's say you're going to Ohio. What's a realistic expectation for someone?
I mean, I'm honestly like just from my experience, even though I was super ambitious, I'll use Southwest Wisconsin as my example because I did that with my buddies. And I can say that leaving the trip, the thing that I felt like was a success is that we ended up finally seeing a deer, because we didn't have a ton of time to spend there. And it was just like I was in the area of deer and I was getting blown at by deer a lot for reasons now I understand, but then I didn't have any idea why. And I didn't know why I was setting up in places that I was. And, if granted, if you do legwork beforehand to put yourself in better places, then you can have a chance at success. There's no doubt about that. And if you're just a good woodsman in general, like you can go out there and you can make something happen. But man, like if you have no experience hunting in the hills and you can just show up and have deer pass by you and you don't get busted, like I would be pumped about doing that on my first trip. Like that would definitely be a big win for me. It's goes to show that your access was right, your setup was right, you had a good gauge on what the wind and the thermals were doing, and you're in the game. So I would sum it up to make it that simple. If you're seeing deer and you're not getting spooked, like I would be super happy with that on my first time hill hunting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I bounce all over. I never stay in the same terrain or like the same area, and that's kind of my expectation every time I go. Is like one, it's a weird dichotomy. Like I've developed a confidence because I've done this for a lot of years, and my standards are lower. Everybody knows, like I shoot 120s, 130s. Like, it's not like I'm going out and Boone and Crockett hunting every time I go out.
Yeah.
So having a realistic standards helped me be successful and feel good about myself. But on one hand, I have this like confidence, like I'm gonna kill. And at the same time, I have this this understanding that I'm getting my ass handed to me.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with it because I'm gonna learn,
Yep.
and I don't need to go home with my tag filled every time. No, I'm glad you said that. I want to get out of the way for a little bit if you need. Now, don't feel any pressure because if you can't think of anything else to add to this question, I'll just cut it out and nobody's going to know I even asked this question to you. But if I got out of the way and just let you talk about hunting the hills or topography, is there something that no one's ever asked you, or maybe that you've said a few times, but you really wanted to drive home to a listener about the hills or topography or reading a map?
I mean, I honestly like if there's one point that I could just continue to drive home, it's like you have the ability to just write your own story when you're hunting in the hill country. I mean, you can do this anywhere for any kind of hunting because at the end of the day, like they all have their own challenges, but each place you hunt in hill country, whether you're spending a week there and never come back or you're going to spend the next decade of your life figuring it out, like you can write this story and begin to understand that area. So always use your experience to trump what tactics or any strategy you hear on a podcast or watch on a YouTube video, anything like that, because that data that you collect, that experience that you had, that's always going to take you so much farther than trying to take a shortcut and get that quick tactic to try to fill your tag. Not only are you going to have more success in the long run, you're just going to enjoy it a lot more because I found that once I started to develop my own strategy and I started to have success with that strategy, like that feeling is so rewarding because you're problem solving out there, you're figuring things out yourself, and you're able to connect these data points to have more success. And like that to me, that goes back to like just getting involved in the process. That means so much more than really just showing up and filling a tag on a 2, 3 day hunt.
Yeah. Yeah. Great advice, man. That is such great advice. Now, can we put the focus a little bit on your job and what you do? Can you talk to people about what you're
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple different responsibilities that I do on whitetail properties in the state of Ohio. I have my real estate license, and so I, on top of helping people buying and selling hunting land, I also, and I do this all over the Ohio region and surrounding states. I help people design and implement hunting plans, strategies on their property. So these are typically in the form of a habitat plan where we are going on to a private piece of property and we are drawing up this habitat plan for exactly where you should put your food plots, where you should put your bedding areas, how we want deer to travel through the property, how you're going to access and hunt that property, a full scale plan of how, in my opinion, you can fully optimize your property. So I do that in Ohio and all of the surrounding states, but the majority of my work, whether it be for real estate or this design, is done in the southern portion of Ohio.
Wow. Sounds like nobody else better that I would want to buy hunting property from than a guy who knows how to optimize that property.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of that's my whole like my end game goal is to be able to really help people through the entire process where I can bring somebody on and build that trust with them in that buying stage and then be with them every step of the way to design that property, to help them improve it, and then if they want to sell it and move on to something different, then to be that guiding hand in that as well. So that's really what my goal is just to establish that presence in Southern Ohio particularly where I can really help guide people through that entire journey, whether it's 10-acre farm or a 500-acre farm. It really doesn't matter, just to try to help them achieve whatever their goals are on that piece of land.
I would imagine it might be kind of tough walking through public. I mean, like, man, if we could just clear that off
Oh
over there,
yeah.
you
I
know?
say that all the time. I have all these places I've developed, not developed like physically developed, but like developed into places I really like to spend time on public land. Be like, man, if we could put a water hole here and then cut a nice travel corridor and turn that into a bedding area, I'd kill a buck here every single year. But
Yeah.
you gotta work with what you got.
Yeah, for sure. Oh man. Dude, that was like probably the quickest hour I've ever had.
Yeah.
That flew. Is there anything? Yeah, I've already asked you one, but is there anything else that you want to say before we wrap it up?
Oh man, I think other than what we've already covered, if you're looking to keep learning, I do post a lot of content on my Instagram. I have a lot of things I've been working really hard on all spring and summer to try to help guys make the most of their hunting season because I know people like to consume a lot more content during the fall related around whitetails. So feel free to check out my Instagram and just keep an eye on whether it be my posts or stories because like I said, I got a lot of stuff in the works and I can tell you, like there's nothing I love more than helping other people have success. I started posting a lot more content last fall. I got a ton of DMs from guys who said they use my stuff to fill their tags, and like I just think that's the coolest dang thing ever to be able to be a part of that for others. So just feel free to check that out, and if you have any questions, just reach out and let me know. I always like to talk about deer hunting. So
Yeah, he's not joking either. I mean, I think if you're a longtime listener of this podcast, I don't know how many times I've actually like pointed someone to something like a website or definitely a product. Maybe, I don't know, it's less than a handful of times. I'm going to say go check out his stuff. It is actually really good stuff and it's well made. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on it. I've already spent time on it after you and I kind of met each other. So I really would encourage everybody on every level to go check out that stuff. Where one more time, just in case they forgot, where can they find you again on Instagram?
Yep. Instagram is Greg_Whitetail_partners. And then if you wanted to shoot me an email, that's just Greg@whitetailpartners.com.
Man, Greg, I can't thank you enough. This is really good. And I'm sure there's going to be a ton of listeners who are like, you should have asked this, you should have asked that. And so if you do have other questions, send them to me. And then maybe later on in a couple months, we can get back together and have a
Yeah, man.
follow-up show. That'd be awesome.
Anytime.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks again. And thanks to all the listeners for coming out to the dojo. We'll be back on Tuesday with a 10-minute Tuesday and then next week with another Whitetail Master. And until then, embrace the journey. Well, that is a wrap for us here at the dojo. We'll be back next Thursday with another Whitetail Master. You can also listen to us every Tuesday for our 10-minute Tuesday episode where I break down a tactic, talk about mindset and personal development, or anything else that might jump in my head in 10 minutes or less. If you like what we are doing here at the dojo, please give us a review. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Mobile Hunters Dojo.